Rain lashed against the cracked windshield of Abigail Foster's rusted 1998 Honda Civic, the only roof she and her 6-year-old son, Leo, had known for 8 months. Desperation is a quiet, creeping thing. It doesn't always scream. Sometimes it just hands you a rusty, jagged key you swore you'd never use. That key belonged to a cabin nestled deep in the Oregon pines, a place locked tight since her grandmother Beatrice passed away 25 years ago. Abigail thought she was merely seeking shelter from a freezing storm. She had absolutely no idea she was unlocking a decades-old family conspiracy. The parking lot of the 24-hour discount grocery store in suburban Portland was bathed in the harsh, flickering orange glow of a dying sodium street lamp. Inside the freezing confines of the Honda, Abigail Foster sat rigid, her hands gripping the cracked steering wheel until her knuckles turned a stark, bruised white. Beside her, curled in a sleeping bag in the passenger seat, was Leo. His small chest rose and fell in a slow, rhythmic cadence that was the only thing keeping Abigail tethered to sanity. It was 2:14 a.m. on a brutal Tuesday in late November. The temperature had plummeted into the low 30s, and the Civic's heater had given out 3 weeks prior. Abigail had tried stuffing newspapers against the drafty window seals, a trick she had learned from another homeless mother she'd met at a day shelter, but the Oregon dampness possessed an insidious ability to penetrate bone. A sharp rap on the driver's side window made Abigail jump, her heart hammering violently against her ribs. She turned to see the silhouette of a police officer, flashlight blindingly bright as it swept over the cluttered interior of her car, over the plastic bags of clothes, the half-empty box of generic cereal, and finally, over Leo's sleeping form. Abigail rolled down the window an inch, her breath pluming in the frigid air. "Ma'am, you can't park here overnight," Officer Thomas Brady said, his voice not unkind, but carrying the weary firmness of a man who had delivered this exact speech a dozen times that night. "Manager called it in. You're going to have to move along." "I'm sorry, officer," Abigail whispered, her voice trembling. She didn't want to wake Leo. I just needed a safe, lit place for a few hours. We'll leave right now." "There's a shelter down on Burnside," Brady offered, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "They're full. We tried at 6 o'clock, she replied, the defeat heavy on her tongue. Brady sighed, his breath mingling with hers in the cold. He tapped the roof of the car twice. "Just drive safe, ma'am. Find somewhere legal. If I see this plate here again, I have to write a citation." As the squad car pulled away, Abigail rested her forehead against the cold steering wheel. A dry, agonizing sob racked her shoulders. It hadn't always been this way. 2 years ago, she had a home, a husband, a life. But then David was diagnosed with aggressive pancreatic cancer. The medical bills piled up, obliterating their meager savings. When David passed away, Abigail was left drowning in debt. Her uncle, Richard Covington, a wealthy real estate developer in Seattle, had coldly turned her away when she begged for a loan, citing bad investments and tough times. Eviction followed. Then the repossession of their good car. Then the shelters. Then the streets. She reached into the glove compartment, pushing aside expired registration papers and a handful of ketchup packets, her fingers closing around a heavy, cold object. It was an old iron key, attached to a faded, yellowed tag that simply read, Blackwood. It was the key to her grandmother Beatrice's cabin, located deep in the dense, unforgiving woods of the Cascade Mountains, about 3 hours away. Beatrice Covington had died 25 years ago, when Abigail was barely a toddler. The family had always spoken of the cabin in hushed, dismissive tones. Uncle Richard had claimed the property was a worthless, rotting shack, condemned and tied up in endless bureaucratic zoning disputes. He had insisted it wasn't worth the legal fees to sell it, effectively abandoning it. The key had ended up in Abigail's mother's jewelry box, and eventually in Abigail's possession after her mother passed. For months, Abigail had ignored it. A 25-year-old abandoned cabin in the middle of nowhere was a terrifying prospect. But as a sleet storm began to rain down on the windshield, threatening to freeze them to death in a grocery store parking lot, the terrifying prospect suddenly became their only beacon of hope. "Hold on," Leo, Abigail whispered, turning the ignition. The engine sputtered, coughed, and finally caught. Mummy's taking us somewhere safe, somewhere with a roof. The drive up into the Cascades was a nightmare of slick black ice and blinding precipitation. The Civic's bald tires struggled for traction on the winding mountain roads. By the time Abigail turned off the state highway onto the unpaved logging road that led to the Blackwood property, the sun was just beginning to cast a weak, gray light through the dense canopy of Douglas firs. The logging road was little more than a muddy rut. 2 miles in, the Honda's front right tire plunged into a deep pothole, the undercarriage scraping violently against a rock. The engine whined, the tires spun mud into the air, but the car was hopelessly stuck. Abigail killed the engine. The silence of the deep woods was immediate and overwhelming. She looked at the GPS on her cracked smartphone. They were still a half-mile from the coordinates. "Leo, baby, wake up," she said gently, shaking the boy's shoulder. Leo blinked, his large brown eyes confused and heavy with sleep. "Are we at a house, Mommy?" "Almost, sweetie. We have to walk a little bit. It's an adventure." She bundled him in his winter coat, wrapping a second, adult sock. Grabbing the heavy iron key, she locked the dead car and stepped out into the freezing mud. The half-mile hike felt like a marathon. The woods were unnervingly still, the towering pines blocking out the meager morning light, creating a perpetual twilight. The air smelled of wet earth, decaying pine needles, and a biting chill that cut straight through Abigail's thin windbreaker. She carried Leo on her hip for the last quarter mile, her arms burning with exhaustion, her boots sinking deep into the muck with every step. Finally, the tree line broke, revealing a small, overgrown clearing. Abigail stopped, her breath catching in her throat. The Blackwood cabin stood at the center of the clearing, a testament to neglect and the relentless power of nature. It was larger than she had envisioned, a sprawling, 2-story structure built of heavy, dark timber. But 25 years of Pacific Northwest weather had taken a severe toll. Thick vines of ivy choked the sides of the house, creeping up to the sagging roofline. The porch sagged heavily in the middle, its wood darkened with rot. Several windows were cracked, the glass clouded with decades of grime. It didn't look like a sanctuary. It looked like a tomb. "It looks scary," Leo whispered, burying his face into Abigail's neck. "It's just old, Leo," Abigail said, forcing a false bravado into her trembling voice. "Once we get inside and clean it up, it'll be great." She cautiously stepped onto the porch, wincing as the rotted wood groaned in protest under her weight. The front door was a massive slab of solid oak, secured by a heavy steel hasp and a formidable, rust-covered master padlock. Abigail set Leo down, telling him to stand exactly where she could see him. She pulled the iron key from her pocket. Her hands were shaking violently from the cold and the adrenaline. She slid the key into the padlock. It wouldn't turn. The internal mechanisms were seized with decades of rust. "No, no, no, please," she muttered, jiggling the key frantically. She hit the lock with the heel of her hand, the metal biting into her skin. "Please." Panic began to constrict her chest. If they couldn't get in, they would have to walk back to the freezing car and wait for a tow truck they couldn't afford. They would freeze. She grabbed a heavy, smooth river rock from the edge of the porch. With a desperate cry, she began to bash the rock against the side of the padlock, trying to jar the rusted tumblers loose. She hit it again and again until the rock chipped and her palm was raw. Panting, she dropped the rock, inserted the key once more, and applied all her weight to turning it. With a harsh, grating screech of grinding metal, the lock snapped open. Abigail let out a sob of pure relief. She pulled the heavy chain through the hasp and pushed the oak door. It stuck for a moment, swollen from years of dampness, before giving way with a loud, echoing creak that seemed to disturb the very soul of the woods. She flicked on her flashlight, stepping over the threshold, her hand tightly gripping Leo's. The air inside was stale, heavy, and tasted of dust and dry rot. The beam of the flashlight cut through the gloom, illuminating a scene frozen in time. Unlike the exterior, the interior of the cabin was remarkably intact, sealed off from the elements and woodland creatures by the sturdy oak and thick glass. It was like stepping into a museum exhibit of the late 1990s. Heavy floral drapes hung over the windows, blocking the light. Thick layers of dust blanketed everything, a massive stone fireplace in the center of the room, a faded plaid sofa, a dark mahogany dining table set with placemats that had never been used. In the corner sat a bulky cathode ray tube television and a landline telephone with a coiled cord rested on a side table. Everything was completely undisturbed. There were no signs of squatters, no signs of animals, just absolute, terrifying stillness. "Don't touch anything yet, Leo," Abigail cautioned, coughing as the dust swirled in the flashlight beam. She walked over to the nearest window and yanked the heavy floral drapes open. The fabric tore slightly in her hands, brittle from age, but weak gray daylight finally spilled into the room. The cabin was fully furnished. Abigail found her way to the kitchen. The linoleum floor was peeling at the corners. She tentatively turned the faucet at the sink. Nothing. The water had been shut off decades ago. She checked the pantry and found a few rusty cans of soup and a box of salt that had hardened into a solid brick. They wouldn't be comfortable here, but they had a roof. They had walls to block the wind. For the first time in 8 months, they were behind a locked door that belonged to them. Abigail found a ground-floor bedroom with a heavy four-poster bed. The mattress smelled deeply musty, but it was dry. She laid out their sleeping bag on top of it. She fed Leo a handful of dry cereal and gave him some bottled water. Exhausted by the cold and the hike, the little boy curled up inside the sleeping bag and fell asleep almost instantly. Abigail, however, was wide awake. The adrenaline was still pumping through her veins. She sat on the edge of the bed, listening to the wind howl outside, rattling the old window panes. She had secured shelter for the night. But as she looked around the dusty, silent cabin, a cold sense of unease began to settle over her. Something about the place felt wrong. Uncle Richard had sworn this cabin was an empty, rotting shell. He said her grandmother had lost her mind at the end, living in squalor before dying of a heart attack in the woods. But looking at the carefully arranged furniture, the stacked firewood next to the hearth, and the sheer amount of belongings left behind, it didn't look like a place someone was abandoning. It looked like a place someone had expected to return to the very next day. By 4 p.m., the meager sunlight had entirely vanished, swallowed by the thickening storm clouds and the dense forest canopy. The temperature inside the cabin was dropping rapidly. Abigail knew she couldn't rely solely on their body heat and the sleeping bag. She took her flashlight and ventured back out into the main living room, determined to get a fire going in the massive stone hearth. Thankfully, her grandmother had left a large stack of split logs in a wrought iron cradle next to the fireplace. Beside it, perfectly preserved under a layer of dust, was a stack of newspapers dated October 1999 and a box of heavy-duty wooden matches. Abigail arranged the paper and kindling. Her hands shook as she struck the match. It sparked and caught. The old, dry paper flared instantly. Within 10 minutes, a robust fire was crackling in the hearth, casting long, dancing shadows across the dusty room and pushing back the oppressive chill. With Leo still sleeping soundly in the other room, Abigail decided to explore the rest of the ground floor to look for heavy blankets or useful supplies. She bypassed the kitchen and pushed open a heavy wooden door situated beneath the staircase. The hinges screamed in protest. She shined her flashlight inside, revealing a small, windowless room that appeared to have served as Beatrice Covington's study. The air in here was even more stifling. A massive roll-top desk dominated the space, surrounded by tall bookshelves crammed with hardcovers and dusty binders. Abigail stepped in, drawn to the desk. She ran a finger along the surface, leaving a thick trail in the dust. She reached out and tried to pull open the center drawer. It was locked. She tried the side drawers. They were locked too. Frustrated, she stepped back. As she did, the heel of her boot caught on the edge of a thick, woven Persian rug that covered the center of the room. She stumbled, her flashlight beam jerking erratically across the floor. When she righted herself, she looked down. The corner of the rug had flipped over. Beneath it, the hardwood floor was exposed. But it wasn't the smooth, polished oak that made up the rest of the cabin. Here, beneath the heavy rug, the wood was deeply scarred. Abigail knelt down, bringing the flashlight closer. The floorboards in a 3 by 3 foot square were covered in deep, frantic scratch marks. It looked as though someone had dragged something incredibly heavy back and forth across this specific spot, repeatedly. Or, as she looked closer at the edges of the boards, as if someone had wedged a crowbar into the seams to pry them up. Her heart began to beat a little faster. She grabbed the edge of the heavy rug and pulled it completely out of the way, exposing the entire scarred section of the floor. She pressed her hand against the wood. One of the boards moved slightly, shifting under her weight. Abigail looked around the room, her eyes landing on an iron fireplace poker leaning against the wall near the door. She grabbed it, returned to the center of the room, and wedged the flat edge of the poker into the gap between the loose board and the one next to it. She leaned back, using her body weight for leverage. The old wood groaned loudly. A rusted nail shrieked as it was pulled from its joist. With a loud crack, the floorboard popped up. Abigail dropped the poker, her breathing shallow. She reached into the gap and pulled the heavy board aside. Beneath it was a cavity, insulated with old, yellowing fiberglass. Nestled right in the center of the fiberglass was a dark green, heavy-gauge steel lockbox. Her hands were trembling so badly she could barely grip the handle, but she managed to haul the box out of the floorboards and set it onto the dusty desk. It was heavy, weighing at least 20 pounds. The box had a combination dial on the front. Abigail stared at it, a wave of despair washing over her. She didn't have a combination. She didn't know anything about her grandmother Beatrice, other than what her mother and her estranged Uncle Richard had told her. She stared at the dial. She thought of her mother. She thought of Beatrice. On a wild, desperate whim, she turned the dial. She entered her own mother's birthday. Nothing. She entered the year the cabin was presumably abandoned, 1999. Nothing. She stopped, closing her eyes. What would a grandmother use as a code? What was the one piece of information she possessed that tied her to this family? Her own birth date, the 14th of September 1993. Abigail carefully spun the dial. 091493. She gripped the heavy steel latch and pulled. There was a heavy click, and the lid of the lockbox popped open. Abigail let out a shaky breath, shining the flashlight directly into the box. She expected to see old jewelry, perhaps some emergency cash. What she saw made her blood run entirely cold. The box was stuffed full of documents, but sitting right on top of the pile was a large manila envelope, written on the front, in elegant, cursive handwriting that matched the old birthday cards Abigail had seen in her mother's keepsakes, were the words, "For Abigail." When the truth comes to light, Abigail's hand hovered over the envelope. This box had been sealed beneath the floorboards for 25 years. It had been hidden here when Abigail was only a toddler. How could Beatrice have known she would be the one to find it? How could she have known Abigail would ever return to this cursed place? With shaking fingers, she broke the wax seal on the back of the envelope and pulled out a single sheet of heavy parchment paper. The ink was faded, but the words were perfectly legible. She began to read. "My dearest Abigail, if you are reading this, it means my greatest fear has come to pass. It means I am dead, and Richard has taken everything. It means he has ruined your mother, and he has likely come for you, too. You must understand, my sweet girl, I did not die a natural death. I am writing this on the night of October 23rd, 1999. Richard is coming up the mountain tonight. He thinks I don't know what he has been doing with the company funds, or the dangerous people he owes money to. He thinks I am just a frail old woman, but I have hidden the evidence. The blueprints, the offshore account ledgers, the photographs, they are all in this box. Abigail, whatever Richard has told you about our family's wealth, whatever he has said about why you have nothing, it is a lie. This cabin wasn't abandoned because it was worthless. It was abandoned because Richard spent the last 25 years searching for what you are currently holding in your hands." Abigail stopped reading, her knees suddenly feeling weak. The room seemed to tilt around her. She fell to her knees, the dusty wooden floor hitting her hard, but she barely felt it. Her mind raced back to David's hospital bed, to the mountain of medical debt. She remembered sitting in Richard Covington's lavish Seattle office, begging for a loan to save her husband's life, and Richard looking down his nose at her, telling her the family trust had dried up decades ago. He had lied. He had let David die. He had let her and Leo become homeless. And judging by the words on this page, her grandmother hadn't died of a sudden heart attack in the woods. Abigail looked back into the steel box. Beneath the letter were thick stacks of financial ledgers, legal documents, and a terrifyingly clear photograph of a much younger Richard Covington standing next to men Abigail didn't recognize, shaking hands over a table laden with what looked like wrapped bundles of cash. A sudden, sharp sound snapped Abigail out of her shock. It was the distinct, heavy crunch of tires rolling over gravel and snow, coming from the driveway directly outside the cabin. The storm had masked the sound of the approach, but now a pair of bright white headlights swept across the living room windows, casting long, menacing beams of light through the cracks in the floral drapes. Abigail froze, the letter clutched in her hand. Nobody knew she was here. The police officer in Portland didn't know where she went. The car was broken down half a mile away. She heard a car door slam shut. Then, the heavy, deliberate crunch of footsteps stepping onto the rotting wood of the front porch. Abigail's breath seized in her throat. The heavy crunch of footsteps on the rotting porch planks echoed through the silent cabin like gunshots. She frantically shoved the thick stacks of financial ledgers and the damning photograph back into the steel lockbox, her trembling fingers struggling with the latch. She kicked the heavy lockbox under the deep recess of the roll-top desk, throwing the heavy Persian rug haphazardly back over the pried-up floorboards. She snatched the iron fireplace poker from the floor, her knuckles turning white around the cold metal. Knock, knock, knock. The sound was authoritative, heavy, and demanded an immediate answer. Sheriff's Department. I know someone's in there. I saw the smoke from the chimney. A gruff, booming voice called out through the thick oak door. Abigail froze. The police? Had Officer Brady from Portland tracked her down? But that made no sense. He had no idea who she was or where she was going. And a local sheriff wouldn't be patrolling a deserted logging road in the middle of a freezing sleet storm at 5 in the evening. Open the door, or I'm breaching it, the voice commanded, followed by the metallic clack of a heavy-duty flashlight hitting the wood. Knowing she couldn't outrun a bullet, and terrified the noise would wake Leo and draw the man to the bedroom, Abigail slowly unlocked the heavy chain she had secured just hours ago. She opened the door a fraction of an inch, keeping the iron poker concealed behind her right leg. Standing on the porch, bathed in the harsh, blue-white light of a tactical flashlight, was a massive man in a tan uniform. A silver star was pinned to his chest. His name tag read, W. Hayes. Deputy Winston Hayes had a thick, graying mustache, eyes that looked like hard chips of flint, and a hand resting casually on the butt of his holstered sidearm. Evening, ma'am, Hayes said, his voice dripping with a false, practiced politeness. His eyes immediately darted past her, scanning the dimly lit living room, lingering on the roaring fire in the hearth. You're a long way from the main road. Whose vehicle is that stuck in the mud a half-mile down? Mine, officer, Abigail managed to say, her voice shaking despite her desperate attempt to sound calm. I'm sorry, we got stuck in the storm. This is my family's property. Family property, is it? Hayes pushed against the door, forcing Abigail to step back as he let himself in without an invitation. The wind howled through the open doorway before he kicked it shut behind him. He stood in the center of the living room, a hulking, menacing presence. That's funny, because the owner of this property, a Mr. Richard Covington, pays the county a handsome premium to make sure trespassers and squatters stay far away from this condemned structure. Abigail's blood ran cold. Richard. Of course, Richard had the local police in his pocket. If he was hiding 25 years of corporate embezzlement and fraud beneath the floorboards, he wouldn't just leave it unguarded. I'm his niece, Abigail lied, hoping the familial connection might buy her some time. Abigail Foster. He told me I could use the cabin for the weekend. Deputy Hayes slowly turned to face her, a dark, humorless smile spreading across his face. Is that right? Well, Abigail Foster, that's a mighty interesting story. Seeing as Mr. Covington called me personally about an hour ago, seems a silent alarm was tripped on the old logging road entrance. He told me to come up here, apprehend whoever broke in, and secure the premises. He specifically mentioned that he has no nieces he's currently speaking to. He took a step toward her. Abigail gripped the iron poker tighter, her palms slick with sweat. So, here's what's going to happen, Hayes continued, unhooking the leather strap over his firearm. You're going to pack up whatever garbage you brought in here, and you're going to sit in the back of my cruiser. Then, I'm going to take a nice, long look around this cabin to see exactly what you've been doing. Hayes's flashlight beam swept across the room again, but this time, it illuminated the open doorway beneath the staircase. The study. Abigail had left the door wide open. Worse, from where Hayes was standing, the beam caught the edge of the heavy Persian rug, which was bunched up unnaturally, revealing the jagged edge of the pried-up floorboard. Hayes stopped. The false politeness vanished from his face, replaced by a sharp, dangerous intensity. Well now, he muttered, stepping toward the study. Looks like you've been doing some remodeling. Don't go in there, Abigail shouted, stepping into his path. Hayes didn't even hesitate. He backhanded her across the face with the heavy body of his flashlight. The impact was blinding. Abigail hit the dusty hardwood floor hard, the taste of copper flooding her mouth. Her vision swam as a sharp, agonizing pain radiated through her jaw. The iron poker clattered out of her grasp, sliding across the room. "Mommy?" A terrified shriek echoed from the ground-floor bedroom. Leo stood in the doorway, clutching his sleeping bag around his shoulders, his large eyes wide with sheer terror as he looked at the massive man standing over his mother. "Shut the kid up," Hayes growled, not even looking at the boy. He stepped over Abigail and walked straight into the study. Abigail spat a mouthful of blood onto the floor. Panic, primal and absolute, overrode the pain. Hayes was going to find the box. Once he saw the documents, once he told Richard what she had found, neither she nor Leo would ever leave this mountain alive. Richard had let his own brother-in-law die. He wouldn't hesitate to bury a homeless niece and her son in the woods. She scrambled to her feet, her eyes locking onto the iron poker, resting a few feet away. Inside the study, she heard the heavy scraping of wood. "Well, well, well," Hayes's voice echoed out. "Looks like old Beatrice had some secrets after all." Abigail grabbed the poker. She moved silently, her worn boots making no sound on the dusty floor. She positioned herself just outside the study door. Inside, Hayes had knelt down and dragged the heavy green lockbox out from under the desk. He set his flashlight down on the wood so he could use both hands to examine the latch. Abigail stepped into the doorway, raised the heavy iron bar high above her head, and brought it down with every ounce of desperate, terrified strength she possessed. The heavy iron connected with the back of Deputy Hayes's skull with a sickening, hollow thud. The massive man grunted, a sound of utter surprise rather than pain, and immediately slumped forward, crashing heavily into the roll-top desk, before sliding onto the floorboards. He wasn't dead, but he was out cold, a dark pool of blood slowly beginning to mat his graying hair. Abigail didn't wait to see if he would wake up. Her entire body was shaking so violently she could barely coordinate her movements. She dropped the bloodied poker, grabbed the handle of the green lockbox, and hauled it against her chest. It weighed a ton, but adrenaline fueled her muscles. She sprinted back into the living room. Leo was still standing by the bedroom door, frozen in shock, silent tears streaming down his face. "Leo, get your coat. Now," Abigail ordered, her voice sharp and frantic. She ran to the kitchen, shoving the box into her oversized hiking backpack, burying it beneath their spare clothes and the box of generic cereal. She slung the heavy pack over her shoulders, the straps digging painfully into her collarbones. She grabbed Leo's hand. "We have to go, sweetie. We have to run." "Where are we going, Mommy?" "It's dark," Leo sobbed, stumbling as she pulled him toward the heavy oak front door. "We're playing a game, Leo." "We have to hide," she said, pulling the door open. The storm had worsened significantly. Sleet was coming down in sheets, driven by a howling wind that felt like a physical blow the moment they stepped off the porch. Hayes's police cruiser was parked haphazardly in the driveway, its engine still running, the headlights cutting two bright cones of white through the blinding precipitation. Abigail's first instinct was to steal the cruiser, but as she took a step toward it, she stopped. The cruiser would have a GPS tracker. Hayes had radioed in his location. If she took the car, every police officer in the county on Richard's payroll would know exactly where she was heading. Furthermore, the single logging road was the only way down the mountain in a vehicle, making it a perfect bottleneck. They couldn't drive, they had to walk. She looked past the cruiser into the impenetrable, pitch-black tree line of the Blackwood forest. The temperature was dropping fast, now hovering in the high 20s. It was a death sentence to go into those woods at night, in a storm. But staying in the cabin was a guaranteed execution. "Come on, Leo," she whispered, picking the boy up. He was heavy, and the backpack threatened to pull her backward, but she forced her legs to move. She completely bypassed the logging road, plunging directly into the dense, overgrown brush behind the cabin. Within seconds, the thick canopy of Douglas firs swallowed them whole. The darkness was absolute. Abigail had to rely on the tiny, weak beam of her smartphone flashlight, knowing the battery was already draining fast in the cold. The woods were a nightmare to navigate. Thorny blackberry bushes tore at her jeans and windbreaker. Hidden roots and slick, moss-covered rocks constantly threatened to twist her ankles. Every few minutes, she had to stop and adjust Leo on her hip, her breath coming in ragged, painful gasps. "Mommy, I'm cold," Leo whimpered, his face buried in her neck. His small body was shivering violently. "I know, baby, I know. We just have to walk a little further," she lied, pushing through a thick stand of ferns. They hiked for what felt like hours, though Abigail's phone told her it had only been 45 minutes. Her arms were entirely numb, and the cut on her jaw throbbed in time with her racing heartbeat. Suddenly, a sound cut through the howling wind. Whoop, whoop. It was faint, muffled by the trees and the storm, but unmistakable. Police sirens. And not just one. Abigail stopped, turning to look back the way they had come. Through a break in the trees, she could see the distant, elevated ridge where the logging road wound its way up to the cabin. Flashing red and blue lights painted the low-hanging clouds. Hayes had woken up, and he had called for backup. Panic, colder than the sleet, gripped her. They would have tracking dogs. They would have thermal imaging. She couldn't just blindly wander the woods. They needed shelter, a place to hide their heat signature, and a plan. She set Leo down under the thick, relatively dry canopy of an ancient cedar tree. "Stay right here, Leo. Don't move." She slipped the heavy backpack off and unzipped it. Shielding the screen of her phone from the rain, she pulled the lockbox out and opened it. She didn't have time to read the ledgers, but she needed to know if Beatrice had left any other instructions, any clue as to what to do next. She frantically dug through the papers until she found a smaller, secondary envelope tucked beneath the financial records. She ripped it open. Inside was a hand-drawn map on thick vellum paper and a business card. Abigail held the light over the card. It was heavily embossed, the ivory paper yellowed with age. Elias Sterling, attorney at law, Seattle, Washington. Private line 206-555-0198. Written on the back of the card, in Beatrice's elegant cursive, was a single, desperate instruction. "If Richard finds out, take the box to Sterling. He holds the true deed." Abigail turned her attention to the hand-drawn map. It showed the cabin, the logging road, and the surrounding topography. But there was a dashed line leading away from the cabin, heading straight north, deeper into the mountains. The line ended at a small, hand-drawn square labeled Old Miner's Shaft, Entrance 4, a cave. She looked up, trying to orient herself in the pitch-black woods. She knew she had been walking roughly north, away from the logging road. If the map was accurate, the old silver mining shafts that dotted the Cascades were less than a mile away. A deep cave would block thermal imaging and keep them out of the deadly wind. "Okay, Leo," Abigail said, shoving the documents back into the box and hoisting the pack onto her aching shoulders. She picked the boy back up, her muscles screaming in protest. "We're gonna go find a cave." Like explorers, they pushed on, the terrain growing steeper and far more treacherous. The ground was slick with mud and half-frozen slush. Twice, Abigail slipped, going down hard on her knees, desperately twisting her body to ensure Leo didn't take the impact. Behind them, the sirens had stopped, replaced by the terrifying, methodical sweeping of high-powered searchlights cutting through the trees in the distance. They were spreading out. Just a little further, Abigail chanted to herself, a desperate mantra. Just a little further. 15 minutes later, the dense trees abruptly gave way to a sheer, rocky rock face rising 50 feet into the air. Abigail ran her weak flashlight along the base of the cliff. There, half hidden behind a massive tangle of dead vines and fallen timber, was a gaping black hole in the rock, the entrance to the old miner's shaft. She scrambled over the fallen timber, her boots slipping on the wet bark, and threw herself and Leo into the dark, yawning mouth of the cave, just as a brilliant beam of white searchlight swept over the trees, exactly where they had been standing seconds before. Inside the old miner's shaft, the temperature was a constant, damp, 50 degrees, a massive improvement from the freezing sleet outside. But the air was suffocatingly heavy, smelling of sulfur, whetstone, and decaying roots. Abigail huddled against the rough rock wall, pulling Leo tightly into her lap. She zipped the sleeping bag completely around his small body, turning him into a shivering cocoon. "Shh, Leo, we have to be as quiet as mice," she breathed into his ear. Outside, the sweep of the searchlights grew closer, cutting through the darkness and briefly illuminating the cave entrance with harsh, jagged shadows. Abigail could hear the muffled shouts of men communicating over the howling wind, their heavy boots snapping dead branches. Then, a sound that made her blood turn to ice, the frantic, aggressive baying of a tracking dog. They were close. Too close. Abigail pulled her phone from her pocket. The battery indicator flashed a menacing red. 8%. She couldn't afford to use the flashlight anymore. She opened the map Beatrice had drawn, relying on the faint, bluish glow of the phone screen to trace the faded lines. The map indicated that Entrance 4 wasn't just a dead-end cave. It was part of a larger network of exploratory tunnels. A dotted line led from their current position, winding deep into the mountain, before angling sharply upward towards something labeled Air Shaft, Summit Ridge. "We have to keep moving," Abigail whispered, her voice trembling. She hoisted the heavy backpack containing the lockbox onto her shoulders. She couldn't carry Leo in the narrow, treacherous tunnel, so she gripped his small, cold hand tightly. "Hold on to me, baby. Follow my voice." They plunged deeper into the absolute, crushing blackness of the mine. The ground was uneven, littered with loose shale and the rotted remnants of century-old wooden support beams. Abigail kept her left hand trailing along the freezing, damp rock wall to guide them, her phone serving as their only meager lifeline against the dark. For 30 grueling minutes, they navigated the labyrinth. The sounds of the storm and the search party faded entirely, replaced by the terrifying, echoing drip of groundwater and the ragged sound of their own breathing. Suddenly, Abigail's hand met empty space. She stopped, raising the phone screen. The tunnel split into a Y intersection. Panic seized her throat. The map hadn't shown a fork. Before she could make a guess, a deep, resonant echo carried down the tunnel behind them. It was the sharp, metallic click of a radio, followed by a burst of static and a muffled voice. "Deputy Miller, I got fresh tracks at the cave entrance. Dog is going crazy. Bring the thermal scanner." They had found the entrance, and they were coming inside. Abigail looked wildly between the two paths, left or right. She dropped to her knees, holding the phone close to the floor. The left tunnel's floor was covered in a thick, undisturbed layer of pale gray dust, but the right tunnel showed a faint, decades-old disruption in the dirt, a subtle groove right down the center, like a heavy wooden cart had once been dragged through it. Trusting her gut, she pulled Leo into the right-hand tunnel, The ceiling immediately began to slope downward, forcing Abigail into a painful crouch. The air grew thinner, laden with dust that caught in their throats. "Mommy, I can't breathe good," Leo coughed, the sound echoing ominously. "I know, sweetie. Cover your mouth with your shirt. We're almost there." 10 minutes later, the tunnel abruptly ended at a sheer rock face. Abigail's heart plummeted into her stomach. A dead end. She had chosen wrong. They were trapped. Despair washed over her, heavy and paralyzing. She leaned against the cold stone, a sob tearing from her throat. But as her hand pressed against the wall, she felt a strong, freezing draft of air moving across her fingers. She looked up. 10 feet above them, barely visible in the gloom, was a narrow, jagged fissure in the ceiling of the tunnel, an air shaft. Piled precariously beneath it was a small mountain of loose rock and debris, looking as though it had been intentionally stacked. "Leo, climb on my back," Abigail instructed, her voice suddenly hard with renewed adrenaline. She scaled the pile of debris, the rocks shifting dangerously under her boots. Reaching the top, she shoved her shoulders into the narrow fissure. It was a tight squeeze, tearing the fabric of her windbreaker and scraping her skin. But the freezing wind pouring down from above was the greatest thing she had ever felt. She pushed Leo up through the gap first, then hauled herself and the heavy backpack up after him. They crawled through the narrow, vertical shaft for what felt like an eternity, the rough stone grinding against their bones. Finally, Abigail saw a faint, gray luminescence ahead. Dawn. With one final, desperate push, she breached the surface, collapsing onto a bed of wet, freezing pine needles. They had made it out of the mountain. The morning air was brittle and blindingly cold, a sharp, shocking contrast to the suffocating, sulfur-laced dampness of the mine. As Abigail hauled herself out of the narrow fissure and onto the frost-covered earth, the violent sleet storm of the previous night had entirely vanished. In its place was a silent, snow-dusted world, illuminated by the pale, bruised light of early dawn. Abigail collapsed onto her back against a bed of wet, freezing pine needles. For a long moment, she simply stared up at the canopy of the Douglas firs, her lungs burning as they pulled in the clean, freezing air. Her entire body screamed in absolute agony. Her hands were torn and bloodied from the jagged rocks, her clothes were shredded, and the brutal strike to her jaw throbbed with a sickening, heavy rhythm. Beside her, Leo lay curled in his oversized sweater, completely exhausted and terrifyingly quiet. His small face was smudged with gray mine dust, and his lips were pale. Panic, fresh and sharp, forced Abigail back to her feet. They had made it out of the mountain, emerging on the opposite side of the Blackwood Ridge, miles away from the cabin, the logging road, and Deputy Hayes. Looking down the steep, wooded embankment, she could see the gray ribbon of a paved, two-lane state highway winding through the valley below. She picked up her son, ignoring the searing pain in her shoulders and the heavy, dragging weight of the backpack. The descent was a blur of numbed limbs and sheer willpower. She slipped twice, sliding through the icy mud, but she never let go of Leo. When they finally reached the shoulder of the highway, the silence of the mountains was absolute. They waited, huddled together against the biting wind, for what felt like an eternity. It was 20 minutes before the deep, rumbling growl of a diesel engine echoed through the valley. A massive timber transport truck came around the bend, its silver grille gleaming in the weak sunlight. Abigail didn't hesitate. She stepped out into the edge of the lane, waving her arms frantically, praying the driver would see her small, battered frame. The air brakes shrieked, the massive tires kicking up a spray of icy slush as the rig ground to a halt, barely 10 yards away. The passenger door popped open, revealing a burly, bearded man in a faded flannel shirt. "Jesus, lady, are you all right?" the driver yelled over the deafening idle of the engine. "What are you doing out here?" "Please," Abigail rasped. Her throat was so raw, her voice was little more than a hoarse whisper. "My car went off the road last night. We've been freezing. We need to get to Seattle." The driver, a man whose stitched name tag read Gregory Higgins, took one look at Abigail's bruised face and the shivering child in her arms. He didn't ask about the lack of a wrecked car, and he didn't question her story. He simply climbed down, gently took Leo from her aching arms and helped them both up into the massive, heated cab of the truck. He wrapped a thick, fleece emergency blanket around Leo and turned the vents on high. The drive to Seattle took 4 hours. The steady hum of the tires and the blast of the heater lulled Leo into a deep, restorative sleep almost immediately. Abigail, however, didn't sleep a wink. She sat rigidly in the passenger seat, her eyes fixed on the side mirror, constantly checking for the flashing lights of a police cruiser. The heavy hiking backpack rested on the floorboards directly between her boots. She kept her hand resting on the top zipper the entire ride. When Gregory finally navigated the rig into the sprawling outskirts of Seattle, he pulled over at a roadside diner. He offered her a $20 bill, but Abigail politely, firmly declined. She thanked him profusely, her eyes welling with the first genuine tears of gratitude she had shed in months. Inside the warm, grease-scented diner, Abigail used her last $5 to buy Leo a towering plate of pancakes and a hot chocolate. She sat in the booth, facing the door, watching like a hawk as her son finally ate. At exactly 9 a.m., she left Leo happily occupied with his food and walked over to a bank of payphones in the diner's vestibule. She fed a handful of quarters into the slot, her trembling fingers dialing the number on the embossed, yellowed business card she had pulled from the lockbox. The line rang twice. Law offices of Elias Sterling, a crisp, professional voice answered. Abigail gripped the plastic receiver tightly. "I need to speak to Mr. Sterling. Tell him Beatrice Covington's granddaughter has the box." There was a profound, heavy pause on the line. The hold music didn't even click on. When the voice returned, it had lost its practiced detachment. "Where are you, Miss Foster? We will send a car immediately." An hour later, the grimy reality of the streets felt light years away. Abigail and Leo were sitting in a sprawling, mahogany-paneled office on the 40th floor of a downtown high-rise. The room smelled of old paper, leather, and expensive polish. Elias Sterling sat across from them. He was an incredibly old man, sharp as a tack, leaning heavily on a silver-tipped cane. He looked silently at Abigail's battered, bruised face, then lowered his gaze to the rusted, dirt-caked green lockbox, resting incongruously on his pristine desk. "I have waited 25 years for this day," Sterling said quietly. His voice carried the weight of a long-kept vow. He reached into his vest pocket, pulling out a small, intricate brass key. He unlocked a hidden compartment in the side of his desk and withdrew a thick, sealed file folder. "What is it?" Abigail asked, clutching Leo tightly to her side, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Richard sent the police to kill me for it." "I am not surprised," Sterling replied, carefully adjusting his spectacles. "Richard Covington built a massive real estate empire, Abigail, but he didn't build it with his own money. He built it using the Covington family trust money that Beatrice legally transferred into a blind, irrevocable trust before she died." Sterling reached across the desk and popped the latch on the green box. He gently pulled out the faded ledgers, the blueprints, and finally the damning photograph of a young Richard shaking hands over illicit cash. "Your grandmother suspected Richard was using the family name to launder money for offshore syndicates. She gathered the proof and hid it where he could never find it. But she did something else, too. In her final will, which I have held in secret under strict instructions, she designated you, Abigail, as the sole beneficiary of the true Covington Trust upon your 30th birthday, or upon the discovery of this lockbox." Abigail stared at him, the words echoing in her mind without fully registering. "Me? Richard's entire empire, every high-rise, every bank account, every liquid asset was built using stolen collateral that legally belongs to you," Sterling explained. A fierce, protective glint illuminating his old eyes. He knew that if this box was ever found, he wouldn't just lose his wealth, he would go to federal prison for the rest of his life. He let your husband die, and he let you starve, because you were the rightful heir to the throne he stole. The revelation hit Abigail with the force of a physical blow. The eviction, the shelters, the freezing nights in the Honda, it had all been entirely preventable. The man who had sneered at her desperation had been sitting on her stolen fortune. A sob caught in her throat, a mix of profound grief for her husband and overwhelming relief for her son. Sterling picked up his heavy desk phone, his jaw set with grim determination. "I am calling the FBI, Abigail. With these ledgers and my documentation, Richard's reign is over. You and your son will never spend another night in the cold." 2 days later, the news broke like a shockwave across every major network in the Pacific Northwest. Richard Covington was arrested in the foyer of his lavish Mercer Island estate, indicted on dozens of federal counts of fraud, embezzlement, and money laundering. Deputy Winston Hayes was apprehended shortly after, found treating a severe, unexplained concussion in a private, off-the-books clinic. Abigail stood on the balcony of a sprawling luxury hotel suite, a warm ceramic cup of coffee in her hands. The Seattle skyline stretched out before her, glittering in the afternoon sun. Inside the quiet, safe room, Leo was sitting on a plush velvet sofa, watching cartoons on a massive television, wearing clean, brand-new clothes. The nightmare was finally over. The locked cabin in the woods hadn't just been a desperate shelter from a winter storm. It had been the master key to taking back her life, destroying a tyrant, and securing her son's future forever. The journey of Abigail and Leo Foster, from the freezing confines of a rusted car to reclaiming their stolen legacy, is a profound testament to a mother's unyielding determination. Driven by sheer survival, Abigail inadvertently unearthed a buried truth that dismantled a decades-long empire built on greed and deceit. Her grandmother, Beatrice, even in death, provided the ultimate protection, leaving behind a breadcrumb trail of justice that waited a quarter-century for the right hands to find it. This story highlights that the darkest, most terrifying moments often lead to the most transformative revelations. It proves that no amount of money or power can permanently silence the truth, and that the fierce, protective love of a parent can conquer the most insurmountable odds.